Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I will be discussing basic human biology. And in order to do so, we must compare from male and female. Basic human biology starts at the chromosomal level that dictates what each sex will then develop beyond the human genome. Now, in the XX, you would find that said cellular division of the chromosome evolves into a female, a woman. And from XY chromosome, we see the genome take a different mutation into a male, a man. Now, in terms of the actual basis around this development, what might we see? Well, we also see different hormones at different polar opposites within said each individual sex. Each individual sex themselves, once they enter a stage of puberty, would then enter an onset of different hormones. And these different hormones essentially cause each sex to develop their secondary sex characteristics, such as for women, breasts, and for men, well, muscle. From the estrogen and progesterone that women predominantly are producing, you see them enter their physiology. Whereas when you look at men, you would find that testosterone predominantly creates their physiology. Now, both of these hormones are technically present within each individual sex, but the rate at which they're experienced is drastically different. As an example, as a man, what is the average male height compared to the female height? On average, if one was to say that the average male sits around 5'8", which is about here, and the average female sits at, say, 5'5", 5'4", if we're lucky for the average, we would find it's slightly lower. And now we might say that there are no structural differences between men and women. But then you get genetic anomalies that are slightly taller according to the environment that which they stem from. And we also find that different levels of hormones such as testosterone, growth hormone, and nutrition all play a part in the development of each individual. Now, from this particular standpoint, let's imagine now, let's raise the bar up a little bit. Imagine if we were lucky, such as in ancient times, that the average male height, according to the way we used to eat naturally, would have been slightly taller. And so would have a woman's. But in the replication, you have to start from something bigger to make it essentially divide itself into something smaller. And also, according to the higher levels of oxygen we had present within said air, human beings would have been slightly larger back in the day if we were to look at it from the perspective as we're told by the dinosaur study. Stepping away from that, let's get back into the male and female. Let's imagine now if I raise the bar up 2 inches to 5'10" for the average male height, and let's bring up the bar to 5'6" for women. That's still a 4-inch difference. What would you say is the structural difference? And now as a man, say 6'2" or above, as the average woman, yes, there are some tall women out there as well, But when you look at the average male to female ratio, we would see that there is a structural difference, specifically in the height. And now what we might consider that an advantage? Well, for one, I can touch my ceiling without having to ever lift my feet off the ground. Whereas if you were, say, here, you might fall just short, which means now for me having to stand to do such a task, you would have to jump in order to touch that ceiling. Which from this we would find there are male advantages compared to the female. In the physiology of the male, not only do they take on a larger body, they also have a denser bone, because in order for a longer bone to grow, it must densen. And according to the levels of testosterone and growth hormone predominantly found in men, and their nutrition stimulates their particular hormones to build said body, just the same as a woman's. But according to the levels of testosterone, we see a drastic change in the development. Now, up until puberty, we do not see a difference in development physically between boys and girls, because they become relatively equal on the playing field until the secondary sex characteristics start coming into play, which then they develop at a different rate. And in this different rate of development physiologically, you also see a different development in them psychologically. Based on this particular difference, you would find men have a drive towards certain things that they are better than women at, and you would find women drive themselves towards things they are better than men at, specifically due to the differences of said sexual characteristics. And based on certain advantages each individually have between male and woman, man and woman, between each difference you would find that not only do they play to their own strengths, but that their strengths vary in themselves. Women are more intellectual than men. Men are more physically dominant than women. And so now came the rule of who gets to dominate the world. What would you argue would win to rule the world? Well, let's see. Yes, the man is technically more physically dominant, which means he could technically outpower the female. But the female is also more intelligent, which means the second she submits and makes him believe that she has given up, and yet now that she pleases him, she gains an advantage over him, because now he seeks her for that pleasure. And now do you see that in the woman you can actively see a way of controlling, an advantage, an intellectual gain of perspective? You could essentially say that a woman can get a man to do anything she wants for him. The same a man could say he can get a woman to do anything he wants for him. The approach in itself is a difference. In the man's physicality, we see that the dominance aspect is in itself a point of attraction. In the woman's aspect, we see that the way that the woman sees herself confident is a point of attraction. But to what level do each of these degrees vary? And is there too much that can be too much, or too little and too little to want to meet on an equal playing field, if you get the analogy in this particular case? If one were to look now at the reproduction between male and female, a study based around the effects of birth control predominantly in women regarding the, you could say, partner selection that which women have when their cycle is not regulated, whereas when it is regulated or shut down. And this study found that predominantly, unless if a woman is ovulating, she does not choose a masculine featured man to be specifically in the presence of normally. And in this case, only when a woman is ovulating does a woman choose a more masculine featured man, broader jaw, broader shouldered, taller, on and on and on. And this is based on the fact that in terms of the competition between the males, we could argue that women typically don't find much comfort around extremely, well, beast-like men. They're too brute-like. Whereas if you find a comfort in a slightly more feminine, similar to yourself, you would find an easier time getting to essentially socialize with said men. But unless if you were then ovulating, then you would see yourself pull towards a more masculine featured man. That is the basis that the study has found. And now when we found that in society we essentially shut off the ovulation of women, it began essentially that there was a demasculinization aspect in itself as well. The moment we controlled a woman's reproductive organs, we essentially found that we also controlled the very biology that makes our physiology and psychology create the attraction between the two sexes. And if we were to alter a man's sex organs to say no longer be fertile, you might see that he might not have a pull towards women in exchange. The moment we alter a body's physiological performance in its natural state, we then see a drastic difference in the environment we then essentially wish to normalize, because this is a different biology in its own. Your cells are acting and reacting in their chemistry of their said biology, and they are reacting different to the normal stance you would have if you were not chemically altered at that particular point. And beyond that, you could alter, say, even a man, and we could then essentially get to playing God, turning each into each other without ever being able to replicate from beyond that point. Let's veer away from that particular subject. I'm not here to preach against people wanting to be people, but in the idea of keeping a level playing field, if I may make this one particular point, however, if I as a man can touch my ceiling, but for you to have to jump as a woman, even if it's just 2 inches to be able to touch that ceiling, that in itself is a physical advantage. And if we were to create said physical advantage acceptance within a competitive field, well, we might see that there is actively a dominance that would be created simply based on the fact of that extra 2 inch. And we could see this grow exponentially. However, in the very basis now, if I may, back to the chromosomes themselves. in the XY chromosome difference between men and women, XX, you would find the very physiology that the man has to take, which is in order to create said Y, you would essentially see that in the XXXY you find the very mating position of said chromosomes, resulting in even the mating ability of said physiological body between man and woman. And in these divisions within XX, you could essentially see that XX becomes an ability to replicate, and XY becomes an ability to impregnate. And from this particular point, we then see that from the impregnation, the life force is already there upon the seed itself. And the replicator, the developer of said seed, would not be able to replicate without said seed. The moment we can control said seed, we can control the replication side of things. And the moment we can control the replication side of things, well, we can actively see we can take a huge weight off of said woman. How do you control said seed? Well, I would argue that simply based around a biblical teaching such as abstinence or holding your seed, if you as a man can specifically realize that every time you simply just unload, you're releasing life. And whether that life gets to live or not, it goes to nothing. And in this particular saying, that life in itself, the more you go wasting, the less respect you, in essence, you have for life. And how can a woman be blamed for carrying said waste of life when you don't have a care for it? Woman has had to make that tough decision for a very long aeon of time, you could say. But in the knowing that once a man controls his dispensing of his seed, because if a man doesn't control his seed, he doesn't control the way at which the environment can grow around him, allowing him to essentially create a better world, a safer garden for now woman and child. Thank you.